forgive me if the connection is bad, and if you do lose me at some point, then they'll take over in WILPF Geneva, so bear with us for that one. But welcome to the webinar, and as you saw from the advertisement, we wanted to address some of these questions that were covered in the book, such as what principles have guided WILPF throughout the years as a peace and feminist organization? Why has WILPF changed its views on certain issues concerning disarmament and decolonization? And does an anti-war organization still have a purpose in our current age, an anti-war organization like WILPF? So Katia gives us some of these answers to these questions in her new book, which covers the time period following World War II and up until the mid-1970s. These were important years for WILPF, but why? And Katia, we want to know, first of all, why did you choose this time period to review?
So hello, everybody. Thank you so much, first of all, to WILPF and especially Nina for organizing this, and Megan for bearing with me as we work through this webinar, this presentation. So the reason I chose this book, this time period were many. First, actually, I have to say that usually at least the first decade or decade and a half after the First World War, people don't think necessarily that feminism was alive after the Second World War. There were no big feminist movements. There were no big feminist organizations, and some scholars have theorized that in this period the feminist movement was in abeyance, meaning that in a climate that was internationally not very favorable to feminism, feminists were reorganizing themselves and trying to figure out where they fit into the larger political environment. So there was a period of feminist re-strategizing, and I wanted to see where we'll fit into this as an organization that was born as a feminist organization and also as a peace organization. The other important reason why this was an interesting period for me was because it represented a really big time of transition globally, where obviously we saw the drop of 2 atomic bombs, but also the rise of the Cold War and the superpower rivalry. At the same time, in the West, there was a big push by the United States to increase its hegemonic reach, and on the East, obviously, the Soviet Union was doing the same in its area of influence. But more than that, it was kind of more. The project was about liberal order. Scholars have called it liberal order making. That is the idea that principles related to the liberal organization of the markets and the politics would spread really vastly. And so this was kind of a crucial period after the Second World War for this. So at the same time in the West, it was a kind of a cold climate, a chilly climate for political organizations, especially political organizations like WILPF that worked for peace. Because of the Cold War. And so I wanted to see how WILPF fit in all of this, and how WILPF reacted to the Cold War hysteria, anti-communist hysteria, how WILPF fit into this project of liberal order making, and how WILPF fit into this abeyance movement, a feminist movement that was kind of dormant at the time. And what I found was quite interesting, I thought.
Okay, yeah, great. And what I learned from the book while reading it is that, like you said, WILPF made some very progressive statements, including some changes on their views that they had once held in terms of disarmament, decolonization, and also the conflict in Israel and Palestine. So what processes did they go through in order to come to these decisions and really solidify their stances during this period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so WILPF did went through really important changes in this period. WILPF came out of the Second World War as a pretty beaten down organization. A lot of our members had died during the war and during the Holocaust. A lot of our members came out of the war in really destroyed both physically and emotionally from what they went through. But at the same time, the organization had to rethink where its place was in the world. How did they go from there? How were they gonna react to the dropping of the bombs, to the rise of nuclear energy and nuclear power? I think that at that point, WILPF was trying to figure out where they stood in this project of global reach of the United States. And I think that at first, they took a much less progressive or radical stance than they had in previous years before the World War. The way I believe they did it was through a methodology that they applied, which I call feminist critical methodology. But let me talk to you about what I mean by methodology. In my opinion, methodology is a process of reflection on how and why we do what we do. Methodology is, in other words, a sort of a theory or a WILPFers at this point in time, and I believe even now WILPFers are producers of theory. And so in this process of reflection, this process of reflection for me had 4 components, and you can read them on the PowerPoint that Megan is going through. These components are 4. So guiding criteria, deliberative inquiry, skeptical scrutiny, and imaginative identification, or I also call it intelligent compassion. Now, the first 3 components, and I will go through them shortly, where I took the naming of it from a feminist scholar who has worked a lot on human rights and has worked in Bangladesh a lot, and she finds these 3 components in the practice of Bangladeshi women's rights activists. And I thought that they really well applied as well to what WILPFers were doing at that time, and I believe to some extent even now. And the 4th component, imaginative identification, I take it from WILPF itself. Dorothy Hutchinson, who was WILPF president in 1968, between 65 and 68, used this word, and we will see how and what it means. So what do these 4 principles, what are they? Guiding criteria was pretty clear. Guiding criteria for WILPF have been enshrined in its constitution, the aims and principles, and the bylaws where we have them. So it clearly anti-war, and looking at disarmament, advocating for a total and universal disarmament, for justice economically, etc., etc. These are where our guiding criteria. But during these years, these guiding criteria slightly changed, not in a big way, but in a big enough way for me to kind of give me an idea that WILPF's ideology itself was changing. WILPFers were trying to work out how to do it, how to be best true to the principles of their founders. So the guiding criteria were, for disarmament, were total and universal disarmament. That was pretty clear. But the criteria in 1959, for example, changed. The aims and principles changed to eliminate any reference to an economic system based on privilege and profit. And that told me that there was something there that had these welfares think about how this reference to the economic system might put WILPF in a position in the camp, in the Soviet Union camp, in the communist camp. And so obviously this change was influenced by the Cold War. But besides this, WILPF, so these were the guiding criteria, were aims and principles, and which changed. And the way the aims and principles and their guiding criteria and their constitution changed, but not only their constitutions, also their policies changed, was through deliberative inquiry, skeptical scrutiny, and imaginative identification. For WILPF, deliberative inquiry, what I mean by that is the idea that you arrive at principles and at policies through discussion. And this discussion has to be as inclusive as possible. I probably, the listeners here will know that at the time, WILPF was hardly reflective of the diversity of the world population. It was primarily a Western organization, US and Western Europe, some members outside of that. And so the challenge for WILPF was to find, was to be as inclusive as possible within the limitations of their structure. And so one of the struggles through these years was to become more inclusive, to add new members, but also in the absence of members, to see where they could get more voices added to the discussion on what to do about the different issues that WILPF was cared about. Skeptical scrutiny is an addition to this, to deliberative inquiry, one of the tools that WILPF used. And what I mean by skeptical scrutiny, again, this comes from Brooke-Ackerley, who named these principles. Skeptical scrutiny is a process of self-reflection about our own assumptions, our own position in the world, and also about the world in general. A process through which we scout for ways in which our speech, our policies, our behavior in the world might reinforce exclusions, might reinforce dominations and oppression. And this was really important to add to the deliberative inquiry, because just the fact that people are added to a conversation doesn't mean that they are really heard, right? And so the scrutinizing the way in which we ourselves personally even may reinforce oppression or structural inequalities was really important in this methodology. And finally, imaginative identification. Dorothy Hutchinson talks of imaginative identification as the ability of feeling someone else's suffering. But more than that, she says, she calls it also, she talks about intelligent compassion. So compassion is not only feeling with others, but also intelligent in the sense that starting from a point of empathy with the other, but also understanding the limitations of this empathy. That it's not that because you are empathetic, you really can fully understand what the other is going through. And so mixing this having empathy, but always in a conversation with the other, so that you're not, again, reinforcing structures of dominations. These 4 principles I see at work during this period, while WILPF was trying to work itself out, find itself, and working for the big principles that had guided it through the years of its existence. And through these principles, I think WILPF came out a better, stronger, more radical organization than it had started at the beginning, after the war ended. And I can go more through it, but maybe Megan has more questions. So, Megan?
Yeah, I think those are great to know the guidelines, but maybe just to get some more. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
All right, so okay, sorry. I wanted to talk more specifically about how these guidelines were used when it came to the issue of disarmament, because that's such a huge issue for WILPF. So maybe you can go through these in terms of disarmament during those time periods.
Yes. See, so I think that what I see here, what I saw in WILF document is that, as regard to disarmament, WILF went through two different stages. One that goes between 1945 and the mid 1960s, and the second one from 65 to 1975. In the first period, Wolf's ideas about disarmament reflected sort of an entrenchment in a political thought that was derived from Enlightenment, liberal political thought, and that really was in line with the post-war liberal order. Eventually, Wilf came to question these foundations. It identified the limits of its own liberalism and then formulated new policies. In addition to, not in alternative to the old ones, but kind of reflected a more nuanced understanding of peace as related to disarmament. So let me go through these principles. So from the mid 1940s and to the mid 1960s, more or less, Wilf continued to view disarmament as a really important part of its mission in building peace. But in the first period, its thinking and policies on disarmament reflected a belief that international institutions and that rational thinking and deliberation in these forums like the UN and all the various assemblies on disarmament and the consent will bring about peace. That is, once we have the liberal laws in place, once we talk to each other, we go go and talk to each other, we reach agreements rationally, we will achieve peace, and disarmament will follow peace. After we have reached this peace in these liberal institutions, international institutions. The other thing that was characteristic of this period was that Wilf believed at this point that science could save humanity, that science was politically neutral, and that scientists, although scientists had in fact created the atomic bomb, but scientists will save us because science was estranged from politics. And finally, no, not finally, but one more thing. Wilf believed that the free market and the global trade, this was very much a liberal, in the sense of the political sense of liberal, not in the way in the US now we think of the word liberal as opposed to conservative, but rather the Enlightenment idea about liberalism as global, so-called free trade and free market. That this was a big push, a big motor for peace. That once states would trade with each other freely, they would reach peaceful relations because it would be in their interest to do so. And finally, the other important element of this is that there was no feminist analysis. There was not much talk about the different effects of nuclear weapons or nuclear development on women or between women and men. No talk about how even the discourse of weapons and armaments and militarization was ineffective, a masculine way of thinking about international relations. And this, I wanted to kind of read a piece from Clara Ragas, a historical leader of the Swiss section, that kind of exemplifies what I mean in these by this when I talk about disarmament in this way, in the way Wilf thought about disarmament. Clara Ragas in 1946 said, "It is true that we have a new ally which pleads in favor of our cause in a more effective and pressing manner than we could do. It is the atomic bomb. With that, I mean not only to say that the atomic bomb will pull even the indifferent out of their lethargy. Fear is a bad advisor by itself and can lead to anything but reasonable conclusions. But it seems to me that the atomic bomb should show even to those most indifferent and to those most apathetic what war means, and make them understand that we are lost if we keep putting our trust in violence." Now, this is a beautiful speech, and I think that a lot of us could still find a lot of truth in what she said here. But what I wanted to point out is that what she's trying to say that believing in the atomic, believing that the atomic bomb could solve our problems through deterrence is very unrational. It's not rational. And if we just talk to each other, we will see that it's not rational, and we will see how the atomic bomb will help us see that that's the only way to do it, is to talk to each other and kind of come to these rational conclusions. Now, this is a particular way of seeing disarmament that changes in the second half, in the second period. In the second period, there are a number of changes. And if you, Megan, if you can put the other slide, that'll be great. So the second period, toward the end of the second period, Wilf arrives at different conclusions. One is that it indicts an economic system, and I quote here, an economic system based on production for profit rather than production for human needs, as ultimately responsible for the arms buildup, and calls for fundamental economic change by nonviolent means as the only way to eliminate war, racism, violence, repression, and social injustice. So it talks specifically, Wilf starts talking specifically about an economic system that drives profits for the production of armaments, and that drives the arming and militarization and wars. So at this point, Wilf starts thinking that disarmament is not a result of peace, but rather a prerequisite of peace, because only by disarming we can disarm that economic, we can start also disarming the economic system that leads, that the interests that lead to our reliance on armaments. And so peace becomes the outcome of restructuring of the international economic system. The other thing that emerged, the other principle that emerged, is a more skepticism toward rules of liberal democracy, toward the idea that if we get together and talk, we're going to solve the problems of the world. And also a little bit more skepticism toward international institutions and laws. And not so much that Wilf cease to rely on the UN and other international institutions Wilf never ceased to talk with the UN, and quite the contrary, but approach the UN with a little bit more skepticism than before. So while before, for example, Wilf never wanted to talk about UN reform, because Wilf was afraid that even talking about UN reform would undermine the organization that they saw as absolutely necessary. In the mid-60s and mid-70s, they start talking very openly about reforming the UN, while at the same time working with the UN. This is also a question of strategy that, if we have time, we can talk about a little bit more. The other thing that happened was that Wilf condemned really unequivocally the use of all nuclear power. While before, nuclear power for civilian purposes was hailed as part of this trust in science idea, that science was good, non-political, and if we use nuclear power could solve a lot of economic problems. They categorically came out opposing nuclear power as inherently linked, nuclear power for civilian purposes inherently linked to nuclear power for military purposes, and so condemned it as a threat to peace. And finally, it started thinking of the arms race as part of the continuum of violence, a very feminist critique of continuum of violence that started in the home and then ended in all-out war between people, and talking about the effect of nuclear energy and nuclear buildup onto women and men differently. The effect started talking about small arms as well, whereas before it really focused mostly on nuclear power, and so kind of expanded this understanding of peace as it related to disarmament, and made it really much more critical and radical. Now, do you want me to talk a little bit about how it got here, Megan? Okay, maybe Megan.
We're actually getting close to question time, so let's maybe shift. That was a good overview of disarmament, and you go into much more detail in your book. But one of your other main topics, decolonization, that also saw some big debates during this time period. So maybe briefly, can you just discuss the issue of decolonization and how WILPF members viewed that at the time, especially when it came to the issue of violence versus nonviolence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, WILPF is sort of the same principles and roughly the same kind of divisions of periods I can see as regard to decolonization. In the first period, you see, so WILPF has always advocated for decolonization, and has always been outspoken against the submission of one people by another. But immediately after the Second World War, WILPF started thinking, WILPF had this idea that the UN and the process that the UN had devised about decolonization was the right process. So the idea that that decolonization had to be achieved slowly, that the trusteeship system, which was the system that the great powers had established to kind of achieve decolonization in steps, WILPF believed also that this was the right thing to do. WILPF believed that the third world was not ready to get to be independent right away. Things start changing, and I think that things start changing in the same way for decolonization as for disarmament, through the application of these principles, through the talking, through the inclusion of other people, WILPF started reaching out and really seek input from people that were not represented in WILPF. One of our great leaders in the past was Gertrude Baer, and Gertrude Baer went to the first conference in Bandung of the non-aligned movement and heard a lot of and really absorbed and listened very well to what the third world leaders at this conference were saying. And by 1971, its idea very kind of changed. In the first period, also you see a lot of talk about independence needing to be achieved by nonviolent means, and absolutely condemning any use of violence, even by liberation movements. And especially the French section was really adamant about this, with one of the leaders of the French section condemning the War of Liberation in Algeria. And at that point, instead, a Quaker from the US started questioning WILPF and questioning why was it that white women were talking about third world problems, or how third world women felt, and through this, the big statement that WILPF comes up with in this regard comes out in 1971, and I think that it was, well, I know that it was very contested at the time. I think that it might be even contested now, and it comes up with a statement that demanding immediate withdrawal of all colonizing forces, but also demanding, arguing that looking for a different understanding of, well, not looking, stating a different understanding of violence. Violence for WILPF became both direct violence, like use of physical harm against each other, but also the structural violence of colonization and oppression and unjust economic systems. And so in its statement in 1971, that can be found actually on WILPF International website, WILPF talks about understanding the violence of the oppressed, or understanding that in a situation of extreme violence such as colonization, feeling that it couldn't completely condemn the violence of the oppressed. It is a really thoughtful and intelligent statement, in a sense, because it came while at the same time advocating the superiority of nonviolence over violence, also giving space for that moment in which maybe people don't feel that they have any other choice but violence. And again, I think that this was reached, this final statement was reached through the conscious and thoughtful reflection process that is made up of all those four elements that I talked about. And only through that process, and with only those four elements, I think that this was possible to achieve.
Okay, great. So your other main topic in the book, if we can just cover that a little bit, because it's kind of highlights the intersection between these issues of decolonization and disarmament, and that is the conflict in Israel-Palestine.
Yes.
So even that was a very contested issue, even for WILPF members who believed in decolonization, because of the specific circumstances of that conflict. So can you just briefly trace WILPF's stance and their way of thinking on this issue?
Yeah, it's quite challenging to trace. This is an important issue, of course, today with what's going on right now in Gaza. But essentially, I just let me highlight a couple of things. Again, here we see a big change. Again, we see the change being brought about by the conscious effort at exercising these four tools that I say. But the big change has to do with the degree of support toward Israel and one of our current WILPF members, Alia Strauss from the Israeli section, gave me this book when I met her first in 2004. It's a book put out by a peace organization called Gash Shalom. And in this book, Gash Shalom, it's called Truth Against Truth, talks about two different narratives about the conflict. One narrative is the Israeli narrative that sees the creation of Israel as the result of as a move against the imperial powers, Great Britain and France at the time, to and to give a land to a people that had been persecuted for ages in Europe. So a liberation movement on its own. And Palestinians, the Palestinian narrative, vice versa, sees it as the perpetuation of the colonization of the area by the Western powers. These two narratives that I think that are still very present today, WILPF really listened or really subscribed to the Israeli narrative for a long time, until the mid 70s, or exactly the mid 70s, with a lot of back and forth, a lot of discussion of whether and to what extent it was the right thing to do. But essentially, WILPF timidly, not very openly, well, actually at first very openly, applauded the creation of Israel in the 40s, applauded the partition plan, decried the invasion, the war that the Arabs launched in 1948 to oppose the creation of Israel. So it was very, it really viewed Israel as this giving a home to, quote, and here I quote the Zionist movement, giving a land for, the land for a people. There is a famous Zionist quote that says, a land for a people without it. I'm blanking on exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
The quote, but that's okay. The meaning that Jews would find a land, the land of their ancestors in Israel, and Israel and Palestine at that time was seen as non-occupied by anybody, not that there weren't people there. And so the Jews would take something that didn't belong to anybody. And of course, this was not the Palestinian story, right? And of the 500,000 or so Palestinians that lived in the area. But WILPF didn't see this until the mid-70s. And in the it is in the mid-70s that WILPF comes out with a resolution that calls for the two-state solutions, that recognizes the legitimate claims of the Palestinians, and calls for immediate negotiations. The way it arrived at this, again, was through these four principles. And I would like, if you mind me, just 2 minutes, quote a really moving episode that Libby Frank, who is an old but very young at heart WILPF member in the US, told me about an encounter she had with one of the representatives, I think of the Lebanese section, I might be wrong, Siba Fahum. And she says the following. I had a book. So she recounts this conversation with Siba Fahum while on a plane trip to an executive committee meeting, and she says the following: I had a book which was anti-Semitic. It was ostensibly put out by the PLO. and I showed it to her. We were sitting together on the plane, and I would say, Siba, look at this. How could they put out something like this? And she looked at it and she said, we didn't do that. The PLO didn't do that. And I said, what do you mean? It showed a picture of a huge Arab ogre wanting to devour tiny little Israel. What the booklet indicated was that the Arabs wanted to destroy Israel. And she said, we don't, never. That's not how we portray that situation, she said. We Palestinians and Arabs, we show Israel as a big ogre, and they are the military strength, and they are trying to defeat us. It was very interesting. It was very enlightening. And I use this as an example of intelligent compassion, because what these two women were doing was really listening to each other and trying to see the same booklet, the same situation, with skeptical eyes and practicing an empathetic understanding of the concerns and interpretation of the other. And so together they arrived at the conclusion that the booklet might have been Israeli government propaganda. Now, I don't know that the booklet was Israeli government propaganda. I haven't seen the booklet, but I think that whether or not it was, it is indicative of the way they listened to each other and really empathized and took really seriously each other's words. And that's how Libby came, herself, in a sense, was transformed in this encounter. Other things, as you see in these slides, you see Coretta Scott King, who was a WILPF member and WILPF friend at a press conference in Washington, D.C. The presence of the increasing presence of women in from constituencies not traditionally represented in WILPF, women of color, women from the third world, women, even dialogues with women from the Soviet camp. WILPF was one of the first organizations to go to the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, the picture that you see on the front of my book is a group of women in the Red Square under the Lenin Tower in 1964. This is a group of US women going to visit Russia, or the Soviet Union back then, and have a dialogue with them. And it is clear to me that these dialogues with these people, with these principles, following these methodological principles, really helped WILPF transform itself into a much more radical and thoughtful organization than it had been in the 40s.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And like I said before, this just touches on, briefly touches on the three topics in your book, and we definitely can't cover all of that. But maybe just right before we open up for questions, Katya, can you just give
Hello?
us a few of your thoughts on the future of WILPF, given where we've come from, and how WILPF can engage with international institutions now? Like, what are the best strategies that we could use now?
Well, I think that our foremothers really taught us a lot. The principles that they followed, I think that we would do well keep following all four of them. But I think that also there's at a different level, we can think about strategies, like rightly you say so. I think the strategies that these people followed are different from methodology. So the methodology is a reflection on how and why we do what we do. A strategy, for me, is the ways to do politics, or ways to approach public entities at any different moment. And what I thought was really strong in WILPF, and I think it's strong in WILPF now, is something that other scholars, not me, have also noticed, that WILPF has the ability of being both disengaging and mainstreaming. What do I mean by that? WILPF has the ability of going out, of recruiting women to go out in the street, to practice a politics of protest against institutions, international or local, that are working against the principles that we are working for, that we would like them to work for. So go out in the street and protest and use a more confrontational attitude toward these institutions. At the same time, WILPF strength relies in also in its mainstreaming strategies, the ability to go and talk to these institutions, be an insider in a sense, through the channels that we have, through, for example, our consultative status with ECOSOC, through our work with 1325, for example. These are all mainstreaming strategies. The two, it is a mistake, in my opinion, to think that the two cannot go together, because WILPF has always used these two together, and it has been WILPF's strength. WILPF, both in terms of membership, the appeal that we appeal to all sorts of different members, those who want to work with the UN, and those or governments, and those who want to work outside of governments, to push governments to do something, right? But outside of them. And so this kind of dual strategy is really good for WILPF in terms of membership. But also, I believe that it's good for change, because we need policies, we need organizations that do both. Governments and international organizations will never change unless there is pressure from outside. And at the same time, they will never change unless someone can translate the pressure from outside into policies and principles that they can understand, and translate that push from the outside into something that we can work on, we can accept as WILPF. Push, in other words, both inside movements and outside movements, right? And I think that this has been really the strength of WILPF. The other strength of WILPF is the structure of the organization. A lot of peace organizations have risen and died in these almost 100 years, and WILPF, together with FOR, with the Fellowship of Reconciliation, are basically the longest surviving, because peace movements starts out of necessity. For example, out of, there was a big peace movement during the Vietnam War, there was a big peace movement in the Iraq War, and then they die oftentimes. And they die also, one of the reasons they die is not only that the issue dies, because there are always issues around to work on, but also because they don't have a good solid structure that can keep it going. And I think that this is a strength that we have, to keep this structure. The dilemma, or the problem for us, is always trying to work this structure in this structure in a non-vertical way, in a non-hierarchical way, which is kind of true to our principles, but at the same time let the structure be there and work so that we can further our principles in a better way and for the long run.
Okay, Katya, really thank you so much for giving us that presentation. But let's open up here. I should pass it over to Nina now, who will open up the floor for questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. I will just open up for question now. To do that, you have to raise your hand, and I can see here on the screen if some of you want to say something. So please let me know if there's any questions. I can see there's one from Marta, so I will just unmute you. Marta Jean Baker, here you go.
Am I on?
You're on.
Okay. First of all, Katya, I want to thank you for this. I came in a bit late because my browser that wasn't working, and I had to change browsers. I read the chapter, and I'm really eager to read the rest of the book at some point. But I wanted to bring up, and I don't know quite how this fits in there, but it's something that, again, I know from my time in the U.S. and also from my childhood when my mother was in WILPF, that during the McCarthy era in the U.S., WILF suffered immensely, but it was also at the same time a safe haven for some people. I know for me as a child, in some ways, WILF activities and WILF things were also, just in terms of the language you were looking for earlier, it's a land without people for a people without a land.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just gave a lesson to my students yesterday, and I talked about it, and all of a sudden this morning it kind of went out of my head.
I also wanted to comment that my favorite WILF button, which wasn't one of the ones in the slide, is listen to women for a change.
Yeah, and that is the 60s, no, 80s, I think, actually.
I'm not sure when it was. I think it came and went a few times.
Yeah.
But I just, wanted to know if you had any thoughts about what happened during the, I mean, some sections suffered more severely from the McCarthy era than others. I know that.
Yes.
And I also know that when I was growing up, as I said, my mother would do these WILF Day events, and it was kind of a safe haven for me as a child, but also a very strange kind of situation.
Yeah, I mean, WILF suffered in the U.S. It was really hard, I believe, and WILF suffered a lot from the McCarthy period, and a lot of WILFers were also in front of the
HUAC.
the House of American, yes, together with the Women's Strike for Peace. So it was really hard, but and also not only the U.S., the German sections actually in the 50s had there was a split between two different sections within the German section. There was a split of who was the real WILF. And the split was partly had to do with the Cold War environment. Those that felt that WILF was too communist, and those, or too aligned with the communists, and those who felt that that we should align more with liberal and Western powers. And WILF suffered, but I think in a sense, WILF International adapted a little while trying to work out how to be radical in that environment. But that's why in 1959 they took out of the aims and principle the reference to the economic system based on profit. It was very Cold War driven, and it was I think that WILF was trying to figure out where it was in there, and I think that it figured out that it wasn't either in either camp. It was on the camp of peace eventually.
I think in the chapter that I read, and you allude to this, and one of the strengths I think of WILF is that it makes connections between issues that a lot of people work on as single issues, and we see how these things are interrelated and
Absolutely.
are constantly reevaluating what we're doing and looking at the root causes of conflict.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that you nailed the, yes, absolutely. And that's, we always say that in WILF, right? We always say, we see the connection.
Okay, it seems like, there's 5 minutes left, so should we take another question? And somehow it seems like we lost the sound. Anyways, any questions? I see there is nobody raising the hand.
I can keep talking and having a private conversation.
Yeah.
Hi, Marta. I'm gonna
maybe we'll do that at another time after this. I'll just want to hear if there are more questions. No, Katja. Yeah, there's one here. I will mute Mater, and then I will say hi to Mary Alice. You are not muted.
I'm Lorraine Miram, and listening in from the UK section here with Mary Alice. Not a question, just to say thank you so much for a stimulating hour in the middle of our week, and we can't wait to read the book.
Thank you, Lorraine, and I can't wait to see you. Thank you so much. This has been quite an experience. I felt very uncomfortable, but more and more comfortable as time went on. But it's really wonderful to see all WILFers around me and kind of feel your presence in a sense. And what I learn from you every day is just amazing. We are an amazing organization, really.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you to Mary Alice. Anybody else who wants to have a question or say something? Let me see, there is one here. Is Helen K. Just a moment. You're on.
Hello. Helen Kay, I'm speaking from Edinburgh in Scotland.
Hi, Ellen.
Hi, I really enjoyed the chapter of the book, and I've really enjoyed the presentation today. It's fantastic. I just wondered, it's a bigger question. I need to read more of the book to know, but there's a great emphasis on liberal philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if that came from America. It doesn't seem to match up with the background of a more socialist framework that was in force in Great Britain after the Second World War.
Mm-hmm. I think that the two strands are always present in WILF. In fact, there have always been those more socialist and those more liberal in WILF. I believe that WILF International as a whole leaned more toward liberalism, and that at least for that, first couple of decades, maybe not even, 10, 15. But Gertrude Baer was a socialist. But it's one thing to be, I think that there's one thing to be a socialist in each country and believe in, the state role in the economy, the social interventions in the welfare state and all that. And one thing is having still sort of liberal undercurrent even within your thought when you deal with international institutions and international law internationally. So even Gertrude Baer, who was a socialist, really thought participated actively in the UN, which was not really socialist, even especially at that time, right? It was not promoting socialist values at the time. So there was sort of always an undercurrent of liberalism, even in sections that were not maybe liberal or were leaning more socialist in their domestic dealings. Even for example, the Italian section in a time where Italian communists were the Communist Party was quite strong. There was a lot of division even in the Italian section, especially again arguing whether disarmament would come before peace. First had states would have to disarm in order to create peace, or whether getting together and talking and having peace first, then disarmament would follow. This was kind of a discussion that went on even in the Italian section, where the Communist Party was very strong, right? I don't know that the Italian women were affiliated with the Communist Party, but my guess is that some of them at least would have been. Does it make sense?
Yes, thank you. Yes. Look forward to reading more in the book.
Thank you.
Okay, we have one last comment and then I will close down the webinar. Anybody? It seems like there is nobody. So I will close down. Thank you. So something goes wild now. Okay, no, somebody just left. Okay, thank you so much for coming. And I hope that you will join a webinar another time. I had somebody who wrote to me if they could get the slides, and I will say that the slides and this presentation, it will be online probably tomorrow on the WILPF International website. So I will close down and thank you for coming, and please keep an eye on our website so that you can see when we have a new webinar. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Megan.
Oops. Sorry, Katja, you were mute.
Okay. I just wanted to thank you all. Thank you, thank you, Nina. Thank you, Megan, and thank you everybody for coming.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I will close down. Something went wrong. I wanted to unmute all of you. It's not possible. So we'll just say bye-bye to everybody. Bye.